Okay, guys, we're going to start talking about percentage of occupancy in Chapter 4. There are some definitions on page 53 that you need to take a look at. You'll be discussing, or will be discussing, I guess, these terms throughout the chapter. One of the main concepts that your facilities have to understand as far as being able to be licensed by the state to operate. And remember, we talked about licensure and accreditation last year, so kind of remember those concepts. But a facility has to be licensed by the state to operate. We remember that, but remember a piece of that is that the hospitals are told how many beds they can have available in the facility by the state. So they can't arbitrarily decide to have a certain number of beds without going through a process first. And we introduced it last year. It's going to show up again right here with the certificate of need process. So when a facility opens its doors or wants to add new equipment, it's got to apply to the state of North Carolina for the ability to do that. So let's talk about licensure. So you may have a facility that's licensed for 1,200 beds. If the facility is licensed for 1,200 beds, that doesn't mean that all the 1,200 beds need to be set up and staffed for 24-hour care. The hospital can opt to use 18 of that, or 18, good Lord, 800 of that 1,200, and they can save, so to speak, the rest of the beds for later for expansion. Lots of reasons they would hold on to those extra beds. And to expand from 800 to 1,200, they don't need to go back to the state and ask for more beds because they've already been approved for the 1,200. Hopefully that made sense. But if they were at 1,200 and they wanted to move to 1,300, they couldn't do it because they were only licensed for 1,200. So that process is very important. Like I said, we talked about it last fall, the Certificate of Need process. You saw it on the Department of Health and Human Services website. It's one of the last things we talked about, I believe, in HIT 110, so it's been about a year ago. So hopefully you remember a little bit about that. And the reason that they talk about census and occupancy and the certificate of need and all that kind of good stuff is because you need it. You need to know what those numbers are to be able to calculate the percentage of occupancy, which is the main one of the main formulas for Chapter 4. And so on page 54, you're given some of your first definitions as far as bed count is concerned, which we just talked about bed count on the other page. But bed count, also called inpatient bed count, is the number of available hospital inpatient beds, both occupied and vacant, on any given day. Then your paragraph goes into hospital inpatient beds and what bed capacity is. There is another term called bed complement also that talks about inpatient bed count, but for the most part you're going to hear it referred to as bed count. What is a hospital's bed count? So that is the number of beds available in your hospital, inpatient beds, occupied and vacant on any given day. We're going to use kind of that same terminology with labor room beds and newborn bassinets as well. So if you look at the top of page 55, remember we're going to call that bassinets versus beds. Our adults and children are going to receive their services in a bed. Our newborns are going to receive their services in what's termed a bassinet. And so that's the difference when you see those particular formulas are listed in the tables. Emergency department beds are considered outpatient beds, and that's going to be key for you to keep in mind. Sometimes when a patient comes into the ED, they need to be held for observation, and that's what this next paragraph talks about. And an observation patient is just a special holding pattern for a patient that we're trying to determine whether they're sick enough, really is what we're determining, if they're sick enough to be admitted to the hospital. Next semester you'll learn about a set of screening criteria that we use on our patients to prove that they're sick enough to actually be admitted into the facility. And that's typically what's going on in observation. We're waiting for a patient to hit a particular level, a particular marker, to roll over into an inpatient status. So we're going to hold them as an OBS patient in the emergency room or on a unit as an observation patient. All right, the bottom of page 55 goes over bed count days, and this sounds familiar from the census terms with the daily inpatient census and inpatient service days. A bed count day is a unit of measure denoting the presence of one inpatient bed, whether or not it is occupied, set up, and staffed for use in one 24-hour period. And then they gave you a term, total bed count days, and that's just the sum, or that's, big and fancy, for adding the number of inpatient bed count days for each of the days in a specified period. So it also tells you that bed count can be referred to as the maximum number of patient days or potential days because they represent that statistical probability of all of your beds being occupied every day. And then they give you an example here. For example, a hospital has a bed count of 100, and then during June the bed count days would be 100, the number of beds, times the number of days in June, which is 30 or 3,000. If every hospital bed were filled each day for a certain period, the inpatient bed rate would be 100% for that month. So, like the last sentence said, that 100% makes sense because the bed was occupied the maximum number of times it could have been occupied in that period of time. So if you read through this and you're like, dude, this is totally confusing, I think it'll make more sense once you start working the problems out, which, ta-da, we kind of get to do that over here on the next page, page 56, and you'll see that I have handwritten out here actual over potential. This is the first time the book introduces this concept. It's not the last time that you'll see this particular formula, and it's just the number of times something happened over the number of times it could have happened, or actual over potential. Actual over potential, that particular nondescript formula will be a lifesaver for you, especially in your RHIT exam. It helps in situations where you aren't given a formal formula because you can really kind of make everything fit into actual over potential. All right, so your first formula for Chapter 4 is inpatient bed occupancy, and it's a ratio or a percentage if you want to think about it that way. The bed occupancy ratio is the proportion of beds occupied, defined as the ratio of inpatient service days to bed count, over the days during a specified period of time. That's a lot of words, so let's just look at the formula. The formula reads the total number of inpatient service days, which is a figure you're used to seeing, right? So the total number of inpatient service days in the period, and then you're going to multiply that by 100. Now you're going to watch me work out and load problems. One of the most common questions is, when do you multiply by 100? So we'll cover that in just a minute. So total number of inpatient service days in the period over total bed count days in the period. When I talk to you about this formula, I'm probably not going to say this part right here. You're always going to hear me say bed count times number of days, because that's what this is, right? So total inpatient service days over bed count times number of days in the period. Now, you know already how to calculate the number of inpatient service days. You were taught that in Chapter 3, but we know that most of the time you've been given the inpatient service day figure, and that's not going to change a whole bunch. What you also have to be given is the bed count of the hospital, and if you will think back to your worksheets and some of the things that you were exposed to in Chapter 3, that was extra information at the time because we really didn't need it. Now you could theoretically go back to Chapter 3 and work some inpatient bed occupancy problems with the formulas because you've been given bed count in some of those problems. So you're used to seeing the bed count or the bassinet count, but we just haven't used it yet. And then they give you some synonymous terms for that ratio: percentage of occupancy, occupancy percent, inpatient bed occupancy rate, and occupancy ratio. For the most part, we're going to call it the bed occupancy rate, inpatient bed occupancy ratio. Then you get some examples on 57. So you are over to exercise 4.2, and we're going to work a couple of these so you have a general idea on how to set these up. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take a piece of paper and scoot this over, and we're going to try to work it out. All right, so when you're looking at exercise 4.2, what you're seeing is a table that has information that needs to be filled in. So this is where you would kind of get to decide, hey, I'm going to write in the book. It's kind of like chapter 3, but these tables are more present in chapters moving forward. I'm going to write in the book, or I'm going to use a sheet of paper to do the work. I don't write in my book because I use it from year to year. So, but you're more than welcome to use this as a workbook, and the bookstore would still take it back. Exercise 4.2, using the information in the table, calculate the percentage of occupancy for each day of the month and then for the entire month, because this, goes on over to page 59. So exercise 4.3 does. So let's take a look at date 1. So you've got your number of inpatient service days and a column for inpatient or percentage of occupancy. The other information that you need is always at the top of the header in your formulas, typically in this textbook. So it's really important before you dive in to kind of take a look at everything that you're seeing here and get yourself organized. So we know that we're working with figures from Community Hospital in April, and Community Hospital has 80 beds. And so if we look back at our formula, total number of inpatient service days in a period multiplied by 100 over bed count times number of days in the period. We've got all of that information in our table. We know that we're dealing with the number of inpatient service days. So for number 1, we've got 75 inpatient service days following our formula multiplied by 100 over bed count, which is 80, times number of days in the period. How many days are we working with? Well, right now, we're working with 1. We wouldn't use the total number of days in April because that is going to be the calculation for the entire month. So keep that in mind. Number of days in the period. The only day in the period we're working with is this 1. So I'm going to write this out. And you may just have written 80 because we're only dealing with the 1 day. But I like to write everything out so everybody can see it. All right, so your answer on your calculator, hopefully you saw 93.75, and your instructions say to round to 1 decimal place. And so if we're rounding to 1 decimal place, we know we're rounding here, right? So we are going to look to the next door neighbor, and we're going to find out that it's 5 or above. So we're going to have a 0.8 as our final answer. Percent. 93.8%. All right, so let's look at number 2. We're going to set that up. 77, number of inpatient service days. If you're following the formula, again, follow your formula, multiplied by 100 over bed count, 80, times number of days in the period. So you should have seen 96.25 on your calculator. We're rounding to here. We're going to look next door. So that makes it a 96.3%. So let's talk about these percent signs. So if you were to plug into your quizzes or your homework, 93.8, and this has come up before, that's a number. Without the percent sign, this is a number. So when you're recording your answers or you're picking your answers out from multiple choice, you need to make sure you're including the percent sign, because a distractor would be this number without the percent sign. So get into the habit of when you are calculating ratios or percentages that you're putting a percent sign on the end. And when you record that in your quizzes and worksheets for me, that's how you'll find the answers for me too. So that's the end of 4.2, and we're going to pick back up with 4.3.